I first decided to retire in Florida after my wife sadly passed away. I picked a small condo on the edge of a quiet development, and it seemed to be just a basic place. Not too difficult to manage, and that was all I was looking for in my latter years. It was close enough to the shops and a clinic, but most importantly the church. In terms of my retirement funds, I had about $350,000, and I thought that was a lot. On paper, it sounded like a lot, but when I was living in Florida, and I'd only been there for not so long, I started to feel that, when I looked around, it wasn't a lot at all. There were people with expensive cars and boats and golf courses everywhere, and they were just so far away from what I could afford. It made me feel like I'd not worked hard enough throughout my life, even though I had worked really hard. I got into a pattern in Florida. I'd go to the shops and pay for groceries, and I'd always see the prices rising all the time before I even had a chance to breathe, and I found that quite scary. It wasn't like I was going hungry or I was behind on any bills, but everything seemed to turn into a problem due to lack of money, and in the sense I thought I had a lot, but it was never enough for what I needed. The days themselves, after you settled in, they started to drag on, and for a lot of the time, the TV was just on in the corner, and I was watching it because I didn't have anything else to do. I was lucky that the development I lived in had a pool, and I'd sit out there occasionally, but there were always people having conversations with each other about things they were doing that day, and I was sort of feeling left out because I couldn't afford to do those things. I mean, I could have afforded to do those things, but what would have happened is eventually my money would have run out, and that was the problem. I loved my wife. She was my world, and I think this is why I went to Florida in the first place, because I wanted to move somewhere away from all the painful memories of our previous life. She was my bedrock, and that is why telling this story is even harder than it would otherwise have been. I'm not trying to paint the people who had more than me as bad people. They just lived bigger and better lives, and they always talked like even what they had wasn't enough. They were always searching for more, but I was never one of those guys who wanted more, and I think that's why I was in the position I was in. I had my health, that was one thing I should be grateful for. I had my car, but I didn't have the ability to live life to the maximum. I spent a lot of time going to church because I'd done that all my life, but you can only do that so much. So what I'm trying to say is that my life got to a point where I was retired, I could exist, but I couldn't thrive, and I wanted to thrive. I remember one afternoon in Florida that really shook me up, and it wasn't anything out of the ordinary like you'd see on the news. It was just one of those things that happens in everyday life, but it made me stop and think in a way I hadn't before. I'd gone down to the pool, like I often did, just to get out of the condo for a while, and I was sitting there with a coffee in one of those old travel mugs. There was a man around my age. He was actually maybe a few years younger, and I'd seen him plenty of times before. He always looked fit, the type who still went walking every morning, and he'd nod when we passed each other at the mailbox. That day he swam a few laps, and then he went under the water, and he didn't come back up. At first I thought maybe he was joking, maybe holding his breath. Yet after a few seconds too long, you could see the people around the pool start to panic. Someone jumped in and pulled him out, and I remember standing there holding my cup while they tried to revive him. The ambulance came fast, but by the time they got him on the stretcher, it was clear he was gone. And the moment stuck with me because it showed me how quick everything can change, and it wasn't about the pool or the building rules or the money anymore. It was about how fragile it all was. I walked back upstairs and looked around my condo, and it hit me that if it had been me down there, nobody would have been calling my wife. Nobody would have been rushing to tell the kids because my wife was gone and the kids had their own lives. I just had me. And later that night, I sat in the quiet and kept hearing the sounds of those sirens fading. It made me think that if I carried on the way I was, just letting the days slip by, I could end up the same, going out quiet in a corner and leaving behind nothing more than the small amount I had in the bank, And it really made me reevaluate things because I wanted more than that. I wanted to still mean something while I was here, not just drift until it was my turn. After that day at the pool, I started looking at my life a lot differently because I knew I couldn't just sit there waiting for the clock to run down. I needed to find something that gave me a reason to get up in the morning. The church was the one place where I felt part of something, and I found myself going more often. Not just for mass, but for coffee after and for small tasks that happened by the notice board in the parish hall. That board had been there all along, filled with flyers about missions and food, drives and trips abroad to help people who had less than we did. But I'd always told myself those things were for younger people, people who could lift bags of cement and sleep on a hard floor and eat whatever was put in front of them. One of the deacons I knew caught me standing there one Sunday, and he asked me why I never came to meetings. I gave the usual lying about being too old, and he laughed and said I wasn't. Not by a long way, he said, and he asked me straight what else I was doing with my time. That struck me. Later that day, I took one of the flyers home and sat at the kitchen table looking it over. It was about a mission trip to the Philippines, a Catholic country, and the pictures showed a plain chapel with kids running in the yard, a banner for a feeding program, and a few men fixing a roof that looked like it had seen better days. I looked it up online and it felt real. Not just a pitch for money. They were asking for people to go and help, not just send a check, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe there was something left I could do that mattered. I filled out the form. I went to the orientation at the parish hall. I got everything I needed, and I even went and bought a pair of boots and a sun hat because I knew Florida's heat wasn't the same as what I'd find over there. I called my brother and told him about it, and he just said be careful and not to try to be a hero, and I promised him I wouldn't. For the first time in months, I had something marked on the calendar that wasn't a doctor's appointment or a grocery run, and it actually gave me a real lift like I hadn't felt for such a long time. The group was small. A couple of younger guys, a nurse, and 2 retired teachers who missed being useful, and we met every Thursday night for a month before the trip to pray and go over the plan. Flights into Manila, 1 night to rest, then a drive out to the province where the mission worked. They told us to pack light, bring gloves, and not to overthink the rest, and I liked that because it sounded honest. I booked my ticket through the church travel agent, filling the HOA form so they wouldn't hassle me about the mail, and put hold on the deliveries, and laid everything out on the bed a week early. I knew it was last minute, I'd forget something, so I wanted to be prepared. When we landed in Manila, I knew straight away that I'd never seen a city like this before, not on TV and not on any trip I'd ever taken. The airport itself was crowded, but people just flowed along. Signs in English and Tagalog, voices bouncing from one end of the hall to the other, and the moment we stepped outside, it was a lot hotter than I expected it to be. I was used to the heat in Florida, but this was something else, and straight away it felt louder, busier, and more alive than anything I'd ever stepped into before. The driver waved us over to an old van, stacked our bags in a way that only he seemed to understand, and we joined the crawl heading toward the city. The traffic moved for a few minutes and then stopped dead, then inched forward again, and I pressed my face to the window, taking it all in. Jeepneys came past, painted like rolling murals, their names and slogans across the side. Buses crammed full with people standing in the aisles, and motorcycles wove through gaps that didn't look wide enough. Kids walked between cars selling bottles of water and little bags of snacks, and that struck me. At one corner, I even saw families living under tarps with laundry strung on lines tied to bits of rebar, and then a block later there was a shining mall with glass frontage and guards opening doors for shoppers. It just didn't feel right to see such things so close together. We checked into a small hotel near the church, and that was going to be hosting us. Just plain rooms, clean sheets, and a desk clerk who signed us in with one of those old logbooks that made me feel like I was back at school. I walked back outside and leaned on a wall, just watching the road and telling myself this was the day and the second day would be easier. The first day felt very hard. That was the only way I could handle change, just break it up one day at a time. The others in the group were excited. Some of them had been there before, and we sat with the priest in a side room while we went through the plan again. He told us not to wander off, stick together, and be careful crossing roads. Even told us that, as if we didn't know already. Told us to drink bottled water and to remember that we were guests and that people would treat us kindly if we treated them kindly first. That day we ate at a small place only a block away. Really nice food, I loved it. And I kept my head down and just focused on the food instead of what everything was going on around me. That night, going to bed and being woken up at 2 a.m. by the sound of horns blasting outside, a dog barking, and a rooster close by, even though we were in the middle of the city. I just lay there thinking about the town we were heading to next. It was a long way away, but I told myself it would be slower there, easier to catch up with things, and I wasn't scared. It was just a step in a different direction. I figured I would do everything that everyone else did and just try to blend in. After a few days, we loaded into 2 vans and headed out. First past the crowded streets and then onto stretches of highway where the lanes felt more like people were guessing than any rules were enforced. Then we'd turn onto smaller roads where dogs were laying in the dirt and roosters picked around the edges. The town we were heading to was far up in northern Luzon, and they had a parish compound with a small chapel, a hall, and a courtyard with a mango tree that gave shade over a cement bench. That was where they told us to wait and where the supplies would be stored. The priest introduced us to the local volunteers, young people from the barangay who knew the area and knew what needed doing, and we split into pairs to look over a few houses that needed repairs. I was paired with a woman who said helped with the feeding program when she could, and she told me she was a widow with 2 kids in a school. She spoke in a way that was very straightforward, just like she was telling me how things were, and that was nothing forced about it. When we got to the first house, she did the talking with the family, and I picked up the lumber and carried it where it was needed, hammering in nails like she asked me to, and doing my best not to be in the way. We spent most of the first day fixing a roof and getting a door to close again, and whenever her daughter called, she would step aside and answer quickly, check on the homework, and then come back to pass whatever tools I needed. At lunch, the priest came around and handed out food and soda as well in small bottles. The younger guys joked around and she ate quietly, then got up to help with the plates without being asked. And I thought about how at home I made little things into big problems because I didn't have much else to do. On the walk back, she asked about my family. I told her that my wife had passed away, and she said she was sorry before telling me she was only 24 and that her husband had been killed in a motorbike accident, and that was why she was helping at the mission, because it kept her busy. She explained that she didn't really have a work, she didn't have any money, and it wasn't her dream or her calling, it was just something to fill the gap and make sure she could feed herself as well as the children when food was offered. There was no sense of romance in her voice, no sign that she enjoyed what she was doing. It was just a practical thing, like lining up for something you needed to do because you didn't have a better choice. I listened and nodded, and for the first time, I realized how much I'd taken stability for my own life. You'd never understood how different things were in different places, because she was more than half my age, and she already seemed to carry more problems than I thought possible. By the time we reached the courtyard, the light was starting to fade, and she said she had to go home and cook food for the children. She thanked me for carrying the heavy things, and I told her I was glad to be useful, and that I would see her again the next day. Over the next week, we kept being sent to the same places, sometimes with others, and sometimes just the 2 of us, taking tools from the parish storeroom, and I started to notice how she went about things. She turned up on time, she didn't make a fuss, she rotated the same 2 shirts and washed them at night, and we went to a house she greeted the family, asked what they needed, and listened before doing anything. Her kids would stop by after school and sit on the step waiting, and she would hand them a snack and tell them to get home and do their homework, and there was never any scene about it. Her parents lived quite close by. They were an older couple who waved at me when I passed, and nobody ever hinted at needing help or tried to steer the talk towards money. I kept expecting the angle I'd heard about before, but it never came. It was one of those things that I did know a bit about, but not really much at all. I wasn't in that world before, so I just took things as they came. I found myself trusting her. It wasn't because she was trying to charm me, but because she gave me the sense that she would manage whether I was there or not, and that was new to me. One evening, the parish put on a small gathering for volunteers, just a basic meal followed by a short prayer, and she sat across from me and bowed her head and kept it quiet without putting on a show. I told the deacon I felt comfortable. I felt I could stay longer if they needed me, and he smiled and said, "Just do what you come for, that's good enough." I had no plans at that point. I just thought that Florida, the thoughts of it had gone flat for me. I felt like there I was useful and it meant something to me. We finished a small ramp for an old man who couldn't manage to step into his house, and after cleaned up, she'd walked with me to the corner where the trikes waited and thanked me again. I said it wasn't just me, it was the whole team. She laughed and told me I always tried to hand the credit away, and that stopped me for a moment because that was something my wife used to say. The next day, her mother sent a plate of banana fritters to the parish and told me to take some, and when I tried to hand a few back for the others, she said there were plenty. It was just a small thing, but it showed me the family saw me as a person and not a wallet, and that way I started to actually get close to them. I'd been there a few weeks by then and everything had gone well. I was enjoying myself in a way I hadn't in years, and I felt like I was doing a good job. It wasn't difficult or complicated work, mostly just hauling things around and holding ladders or putting in simple fixes. But the point was I felt useful again, and that had been something I was missing in Florida. The next week went on much the same. Mornings spent loading up tools with the parish storeman, afternoons sweating through repairs, and evenings gathered with the group over rice and other dishes that they liked. We'd talk about jobs we'd done and ones that were coming the next day. The days felt like they were the same, but I didn't mind it because it gave me something to wake up for. By then, I also knew the end was coming because my return flight was booked and the parish had told us a new group was arriving, and part of me was already shifting back towards Florida, wondering what I'd do with myself when I got there. I told myself I could be satisfied, that this had been worth the time that I'd given, and I'd left a small mark, however small it was. Then one afternoon, after a long day checking a roof that needed patching, we were putting tools back in the storeroom, standing around talking about nothing in particular, and then she leaned in and kissed me. It was sudden, no warning, no lead up, and it was just like that. And when she pulled back, she gave me a small smile as if it was the most natural thing in the world. We didn't mention it as we walked out. She went off towards her kids and I went back to the parish room, and the whole way I kept replaying it in my head. Later that night I went to bed and I couldn't get to sleep. Not because I was dreaming up a future or chasing a fantasy. It was because I couldn't shake the thought that it had happened at all. I told myself all along that this was temporary, that I would do my part and go home. But laying there I found myself wondering if I really wanted to leave. I didn't have a plan. I didn't make any decisions. I didn't even say anything out loud. But that one small thing shifted something in me, and for the first time since I got there, I wasn't thinking about going back to Florida at all. The next morning, I walked into the parish hall and the place was already busy. Tools being checked, list on the table, people moving in and out with the half energy you get when you know the trip is almost done. I had only a few days left before I was due to fly home, and it was sitting in the back of my head even as I picked up a hammer and counted nails into a tin. She was there with the others, nothing different in the way she dressed or spoke, just the same plain shirt and tied back hair. But when our eyes met across the table, she gave me a smile that stopped me. It wasn't the polite kind, it wasn't a thanks for helping out. It lingered a second longer, and it made me wonder what was going on. I tried not to stare, tried to keep moving like nothing was different, but when I glanced back, she was still looking at me, still holding that small smile, like she was letting me in on something. I felt caught off guard, not in a bad way, just surprised, and it stayed with me through the morning while we loaded up the vans and headed out. The work was the same as it had been all week: nails, timber, hauling sheets of tin, but I'd catch myself looking across to where she was, waiting to see if she would glance back again. Sometimes she did, sometimes she didn't, and each time she did it, she gave me the same jolts as the first look. By the time we packed up in the late afternoon, I was wound up in my own head, trying to keep my hands busy so nobody noticed. As the tools were going back into the storeroom and the younger ones were laughing about the job, she came over and stood close enough, and I even heard her say something without raising her voice. She said, "This evening, after everything's finished, I want to talk to you about something." Then, as if nothing had happened, she walked away with her kids, and that was it. I stood there holding a hammer like I'd forgotten what it was for, and all I could think about was what she meant and why she wanted to talk to me alone. That evening, when the work was wrapped up and everyone was heading their separate ways, I walked with her as far as the corner where I usually caught a trike back to the hotel. Her kids were with her parents, and she usually stayed with them too, but this time she stopped and said, "How about we go for a drink together?" It caught me off guard, because up until then our talk had been plain and practical, but I said yes, and we walked down to a small place just outside the hotel I was staying at and ordered a bottle of beer each. She sat across from me, quiet for a moment, and then told me that she liked being with me, that I was different from the other men she'd met, and that she felt like she could get used to having me around. I didn't know what to say at first, because it had been years since anyone had said something like that to me, and I sat there with the bottle in my hand and the ground underneath felt like it was shifting. I was 62 and she was 24, and I told her straight that the age difference worried me. She laughed a little and shook her head and said it wasn't a problem for her, that men my age had already lived and knew what they wanted, and that she didn't care what anyone else thought. I pressed her on it because it didn't feel right to ignore, but she held her line and told me again that it didn't matter. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me thought I was a fool, but I couldn't deny I liked hearing it. I mentioned my faith, how I was always being part of the church, not strict in most senses, but I knew what it was about marriage and commitment, and I told her I wasn't taking any of this lightly. She listened and nodded and told me she understood, and she wasn't trying to trap me or make me promise anything I couldn't keep, only that she wanted to see where it could go. That did ease me a little, and I asked her how she thought something like this could even work, me being who I was with her with 2 kids and a life already set. She said we could make it work the same way anything else worked, by showing up each day, being honest, and she smiled and said, "I want to show you something." That took me back. She said, "I want to show you something." She stood up and I followed her out onto the street, going away from my hotel. I didn't know what she meant, and for the first few steps I was just walking behind her, past the small shops that were shutting down and the motorbikes parked so tightly together, trying to guess what she had in mind. She didn't explain, she just kept walking with a smile on her face, with the same confidence she always held. I found myself just going along, curious and a little uneasy, waiting to see where she was heading. Then she stopped at a hotel. That night was the best of my life, and from then on, the thought of not being with her scared me more than anything else. It hit me fast and it hit me hard. All I wanted was her, and I started running ideas through my head about how I could make it work without going back to the States. I told myself I could stay, I could stretch what I had, I could build something here, but the truth was I knew I had to return to put my affairs in order if I was serious. The last few days with the parish were busy, wrapping up projects and handing things back to the local volunteers, and the church put on a send-off meal for all of us. There were speeches, prayers, and thanks for what we'd done, and I stood there smiling, but the truth was I was only waiting for it to finish so I could walk out with her. We found as much time together as we could before I left, and each time I looked at her, I felt more certain. When the dame came to fly home, I promised her I would be back as soon as I could, and she didn't ask me for anything more than that. Just gave me a look as if that was what she expected me to do. She expected me to keep my word. Back in America, I lasted a month. I spoke to her every single day, not missing a day, counting the hours until I could return. I was nervous to tell anyone what had happened because I knew how it sounded. 62 with a 24-year-old widow I'd met on a church trip, and I could already hear the voices of people who would say I was a fool. But I didn't care, because it felt right, and I was in love with her from that night. She had been the one to make the first move, and in my mind, that meant she felt the same. That was enough to keep me moving forwards. Each call we made across the distance pulled me closer to her in a way, and while I cleaned out my pace and tied up the loose ends, my head was already back in that town in the Philippines. The thought of Florida, it just felt hollow, like a shadow of a life I'd already stepped out of, and every morning I woke up wanting nothing more than to be with her again. By the time I booked my ticket, I'd no doubts, and all I thought about was how soon I could stand beside her. When I was back in the Philippines, it was different. This time I wasn't part of the parish group. I was just a man meeting a woman who meant more to me than I could explain, and it felt now or never. It felt new all over again. I flew into Manila and she met me there, and even though she wasn't from the city, she took me around like she wanted to see things that I'd missed. We walked through Rizal Park and sat by the fountain while families took photos. We went to Intramuros and I listened as a guide told stories about the old walls. And we stood at the gates of Fort Santiago and watched school children in uniforms lining up. She took me into Quiapo, where the market stalls seemed to go on forever, and I couldn't believe how many people moved through those narrow streets all at once. And then later, we sat in a cafe in Makati, where the traffic outside never seemed to stop. I'd never seen the contrast so close together before, and it struck me how the city held both sides at once. The crowded alleys with wires hanging low, and the glass towers that made me feel like I could have been anywhere in the world. Instead of pushing me away, it pulled me in, and I started to believe I belonged there. I gave myself over to it. She was the same. She laughed when I was surprised and told me she saw it through my eyes, and that made me love her even more. After a week of walking the streets and eating street food and getting lost on jeepneys, I knew she was the one, and I believed so. I knew it. We sat in a quiet place near Manila Bay one evening, just looking out at the water, and we decided we needed to get married. Part of it was my faith, knowing I couldn't keep on with her without putting a ring on her, and part of it was the way she looked at me, as if it was already decided. We spent the next few months together in Manila, arranging it all, visiting the offices and lining up at the civil register, filling out the forms we needed to do and waiting our turn. It felt right though, and I was happy to be doing it. By the time the papers were all in order and signed, we stood there together as husband and wife, and I knew I stepped out of one life and into another. I didn't want to look back. I only wanted to look forwards. After the marriage, it hit me that I hadn't once stopped to think about where we were actually going to live. Up until then, I'd been floating through each day, caught up in being with her, caught up in the rush of it all, and the question hadn't crossed my mind. One evening, she asked me what I thought we should do, because her children were still staying with her parents, and that wasn't something she wanted to carry on forever. She told me straight that she wanted to go and live up there too, close to them, in the same part of northern Luzon where the parish mission had been and where I'd already spent those weeks working. She said it was where the children belonged, where she belonged, and that it would be easier on everyone if we built our life there instead of trying to start somewhere new. The way she said it, it wasn't up for debate. It was clear this is what she wanted. But there was no sharpness to it, it was just her telling me how she saw our life together. I sat there thinking about it, and what I expected was pretty simple. I pictured mornings with her children running around and their grandparents close by, her being able to lean on her family when she needed, and me fitting into it, helping out, working around the house if needed, and going to the parish if they needed extra help. You have to understand that I wasn't going into the Philippines with the idea to meet someone. I didn't watch or research anything about it beforehand. That wasn't me. I was just there, in the middle of it, not planning or anything like that. I wasn't trying to pick it apart or look at what could go wrong. That wasn't me. And when she said we should live there, it sounded fine. It felt like something I could handle and something I actually wanted, because it tied me to her in a way that made sense. She said it made sense for her and the kids, and I told her that was enough for me. When she smiled back, I knew I'd given the answer she'd been hoping for. And from that moment on, it wasn't a question anymore. I was going to live up north with her, and in my head, it felt right. It felt like what we should do. Before heading north to where she wanted us to live, we went to Cebu for a week as a kind of honeymoon. We stayed at a resort by the beach, and for the first time since we'd met, we didn't have to think about anything but each other. We swam in the sea, we ate, and we went out nighttime and did all kinds of amazing things, and I remember thinking that I hadn't felt that free since I was much younger. I was in love, and I didn't care about the age gap. I just felt glad to be with her. We took a boat out one afternoon and looked back at the city from the water, and she leaned on my shoulder and said that she'd never, ever been anywhere like that before. We spent another day walking around malls in Cebu, buying small things that we probably didn't need, but I enjoyed seeing her happy and pointing things out as if it was all new to her. One evening, we found a little grill stall near the resort and ate what they served to us on paper plates and laughed when the sauce spilled, and I thought to myself that I didn't need anything more than this. After that week, we flew back to Manila and decided that before going up to the province, we needed to buy a car to make life easier for us there. So we went to a dealer and we bought one. It cost $25,000, and yes, I did put it in her name because at the time I didn't know any different. From there, we travelled north to her province without wasting time. We rented a small place near her parents so we could settle in while we figured things out. Within a week, we found a piece of land close to her parents' home, and after some back and forth with the owner, I paid $40,000 for it. We were introduced to a local builder who said he could put up a house for us, and we agreed to go ahead. Construction started almost right away, and by the time the first week was done, we had money going out in every direction. The house would end up costing $100,000 by the time it was finished, but at that point all I cared about was staking my claim and her claim to our new life. I didn't sit around running numbers or anything like that. I was just too deep into the rush of it all, building this life with her, and I saw the future as nothing but bright. The following year, I have to admit, was one of the best years of my life. The house was finally finished, her children had moved in with us, and life, it felt complete. Our days fell into just a normal pattern, and before long it felt like I'd always lived there. I didn't think about Florida anymore. I didn't want to think about it. I was happy. I was always the one that made coffees in the mornings, she got the children ready for school, and it was just like a normal family that I remembered back when I had my wife in the States and my kids. It felt like I was starting again in that sense, and I was enjoying it. There was a cafe that we liked to go to quite regularly. We'd get coffee and bread from there, and before long, you start recognizing people saying hi or nodding at them politely. It was as if I actually belonged there, and I felt I did. I continued to go to Mass on Sundays, although she didn't go with me all the time, and afterwards we'd go for a meal in a restaurant, although it wouldn't be anything great because it was a very remote area. Afternoons were fun. Her kids would play outside and I'd just do odd jobs every now and then when things needed doing, or I'd just read a book or do whatever it is I also was doing. I loved the evenings the most. We'd sit outside, under the sun, all the village noises around us. But they'd fade as the hours drifted into night, and I felt like this was where I belonged. I hadn't been searching for this, but this is where I belonged, and I let myself believe that it was always going to be this way. I stopped thinking about my money, I stopped worrying about what might happen next, and about halfway through the year I made a choice that seemed so natural. Because I was getting older and she was younger, I decided to move the rest of my money, what was left of it, over to the Philippines so she could manage it. I thought that would make things easier. Then it wouldn't be me transferring money all the time and making sure things were good. It would be her responsibility, and I trusted her completely. As soon as the money landed in the Philippines, I put it into an account for both of us and gave her access to manage it. It was a natural step, it felt like, and it felt like the right decision. I had no thought that it would have been the worst decision of my life. The next year went by and everything seemed to be going well. Life was everything I could have dreamed of. And for a man my age, I couldn't have been happier. The children were doing well in school, and I thought we had a future that was secure. I never spent much, I never had done that, and I believed that what was left would last for 20 years if we were careful. Then, one evening, she sat me down at the table and told me straight that the money was gone. At first, I thought I misheard her because it didn't seem possible. I'd been careful all my life, never chasing expensive things, never wasting what I had, and now she was telling me it was finished. She explained it to me as if it was all reasonable, saying she'd paid off debts for her family that I'd never heard about before, that she'd bought things for people because they needed them, and that she bought 2 more plots of land because she believed that they would be good investments for us. I just sat there stunned, because when I said manage the money, what I meant was pay the bills, buy the food, take care of the house, keep things running. For her, it meant something else entirely, that she could spend it as she saw fit if she believed it was help us. We went back and forth, me asking why she hadn't told me, her saying she thought she was doing the right thing and she truly believed it. I didn't feel the need to shout. I didn't want to storm out. I just sat there looking at her, trying to understand what she was saying. I knew what she was saying, but it was hard to believe it was true. Then she said it again, and I had to face facts. When I asked her, "Do you mean it's all gone, every single peso?" she nodded and said there was about 10,000 pesos left. That was when I felt like everything I'd worked for had been lost and I didn't know what to do. The next day after she told me the money was gone, I woke up knowing I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. I still loved her, but it wasn't the same, because what she'd done felt like betrayal. I couldn't get my head around it, and she didn't seem to understand why it cut so deep. She didn't see that I had nothing left, not even enough to buy a ticket home, and when I tried to explain it to her, she looked at me like I was making a fuss over something that would sort itself out. We argued, and I kept asking how she could think it was right to spend without telling me, and she kept saying she believed she was doing it for both of us. It went around in circles until I knew there was nothing left to say, and I saw it in her face that nothing I said would change what had already been done. That was halfway through 2018 when I had to leave. I managed to sell some things to raise enough money for a ticket, and I packed everything I had into a bag. Not much for a man who worked his whole life, and I stood there in the room wondering how it had all come to this. She didn't try to stop me, although I could tell she wanted to. She stood in the doorway quiet, and she didn't shout, she didn't cry, just watched, and it hurt because I knew she didn't want to show any emotion. At the airport, she waited for me at the curb, waved once and turned away before I even walked through the doors, and that was the last time I ever saw her. I flew back to America with less than $1,000, and the whole flight I couldn't think of anything except the fact that everything I'd built, everything I'd saved had vanished. She called quite a few times in the first few weeks of me getting back, her number flashing up again and again, and I stared at it, but I never picked up. After around 6 months, the call stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. I still love her, I still think about her all the time, but what she did destroyed me, and I don't know if I will ever recover from it, because 7 years later, I still haven't recovered from it.